Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Art Basel Conversations. It's a great pleasure to be here. I'm András Szántó, and I want to thank, as I always do, the Art Basel organizers for adding a little bit of intellectual excitement around all the commercial excitement that's taking place here at the fair. I think it's with everyone from the art world coming here, it's a wonderful opportunity to exchange ideas. And today, we're here to talk about an institution that we all love and which is changing very quickly and confronting a host of new challenges, the museum. In particular, we're talking about how will museums collect in the future. So it's a very small topic, which we will be able to cover hopefully in an hour. We couldn't have a more distinguished trio of guests representing really an extraordinary cross-section of museums. I will very quickly just mention them. Chris Dercon to my right recently arrived is at the Tate Modern after posts in Munich and Rotterdam. Nancy Spector, long-serving chief curator of the Guggenheim Museum, and I will say more about them as we go on. And Martin Roth of Dresden, where he oversees a whole cluster of collections, and who, as many of you know, is about to take up his new post at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. So please give them a hand in advance for their thoughts today. So at risk of stating what is completely obvious, let me suggest that there are, by and large, 5 sort of epic forces that are framing the question of how museums are going to be able to develop their collections in the future. The first, which we can see certainly here at Art Basel, is the extraordinary increase in the scale of art production and also inflation of values over the last few decades, which is confronting museums in particular when it comes to contemporary art with very tough choices about what they can or should collect. The second, which is closely connected with all of this, again very pertinent for Art Basel, is the dramatic increase and expanding role of private collectors in shaping the directions of museums, particularly in America, but increasingly in Europe as well, both through their gifts of art that museums can no longer afford on their own, through their financial patronage, and increasingly, of course, in recent years, the creation of their own, I should say, museum-like entities around the world. The third important driving force is cultural policy. All around the world, we are living in a moment coming out of this crisis where the question of public financing for museums and their collections is increasingly under attack, and governments everywhere are trying to think in new ways about financing their institutions. Fourth, globalization, which is propelling museums into new regions and urging them to undertake new types of collaborations, often with governments and in countries where such engagement is fraught with complexity and controversy. Let me say right at this moment that those of you who came to this panel expecting a gladiator fight about Ai Weiwei between Mr. Roth and Mr. Dercon came to the wrong panel. We will talk about China and other difficult parts of the world at some point. Fifth, of course, technology. Technology is linking audiences to museums in new ways. It's allowing people to experience collections at great distances. And here as elsewhere, it is a strongly disruptive force. So all of this is shaping our topic in some ways. And what I'm hoping today is that we can sort of circumnavigate some issues around collection development, why we collect. And perhaps what we could do is begin later on at this panel with some practical questions. You know, where's the money coming from? How do you collaborate on acquisitions? How could museums work better together? What kind of legal and regulatory obstacles do they need to overcome to continue to do their work? And then we'll hopefully get to the more sublime and decidedly more fun questions, which can be quite philosophical. Why should we collect? What should we collect? How should museums balance their ever-expanding set of other functions beyond collecting with their primary responsibility of collecting? And very importantly, what are perhaps some of the ethical bargains that need to be struck with private collectors, with governments, with foreign parties? How do you feel your way around those issues if you're at the helm of a major institution where you have to make decisions on these kinds of difficult questions every day? So, as I said, we couldn't have a better group of conversationalists here today. And what I'm going to do is I'll ask each of them first what's sort of on the top of their mind when it comes to thinking about museums and their collections. And then we'll talk for a while, and hopefully you'll all make this very easy for me by talking to each other as much as with me. And then if all goes well, there should be some time for audience questions at the very end. So, Martin, I think we'll start with you, if it's okay. You're currently the head of the State Museums in Dresden. You've run other German collections. You've been involved in major international events, expos as well. You've been in charge of collections which are seen in Germany as major national assets. You're now coming to the United Kingdom, taking over another preeminent institution which is seen as one of the great emblems of that country. And of course, you worked a lot around the globe, most recently in China. How have these experiences shaped your understanding of why museums should collect?
Thank you, András, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting us. I think it's honestly a crucial question, the way we collect in the future. And maybe you give me a hard time to talk about this while I'm leaving in Dresden, because if we talk about the success of the last 10 to 20 years after reunification, collecting is definitely one of the most difficult parts of the whole variety of topics that we have. If we think in a very classical way about collecting, research, conservation, and presentation, then the collecting itself is the most difficult one. I try to say a few words provoking a discussion, then I explain in the end why I have this opinion and why I changed my opinion pretty much during the last 10 to 15 years. Collecting in a museum's compilation like we have in Dresden, it's 12 museums, 12 to 14 museums, depending on how you count it. It's much more collection in itself. We celebrated our 450th anniversary last year, so it's a real classical European collection. But we had no chance to collect during the last 20 years. That means if a museum that is not collecting is not a museum any longer. It's just an archive you work with. So the way we try to continue is to explain to the public, and at least to the government, that collecting in a state art collection has something to do with creating a legacy, heritage. We talk about the reconstruction of the past. It's not about collecting contemporary, when this is something we have to discuss also in this kind of classical museums. But it's the question how you complete collections that started in the 15th, 16th century with a new approach to new collections from private collectors, for example. How you collect today old masters in a time where it's extremely difficult just to raise money for contemporary in a museum's variety that we have, like we have in Dresden. So there is only a small chance to work like this. It has a lot to do with education. It has a lot to do with creating narratives to the public. When we live in a city with 500,000 inhabitants, more than 2.5 million visitors a year, this is a kind of task, this is a kind of demanding position if it comes to talk about our global culture and our global heritage. So it's much more than only collecting one or the other item. It's the question of the whole variety and how does it fit in the museum's collections itself and in the whole with the whole view. Second point, in my opinion, collecting in a museum's complex like in Dresden means it's a service of a democratic society. It's art history on one part, but it's how to work in a democratic society with the collections that started long time ago in a royal dynasty. How to balance today a collection that, let's say, started 200 years ago, 250 years ago. We reopened, for example, the beautiful so-called Turkish chamber, an Islamic collection that started 250 years ago, and it's beautiful, it's stunning, but it has to be continued. Or is it just a fragment? Do we leave it like it is today and say it's part of history, that's finished, it's over? Or is there an interest to do more research, to continue to collect, and to work with this collection in the future? You know, the reason why I have this kind of position and the reason why I'm really open to work together with private collectors and art dealers and so on, but I really insist that the government is paying for those collections is what I said before, it's part of a democratic system. When I started in the museums business, let's say end of the 80s, early 90s, I had this kind of political opinion, then I still have it somehow. In a way, we don't need the government. We don't need the government's money. Actually, I want to have all my freedom to do what I want to do. And if there is a minister who wants to tell me what I have to do, the easiest way to get out of that problem is you don't ask for money. But then I realized, working in more classical museums, that there is a kind of, how to explain, a kind of obligation, a kind of necessity, a kind of responsibility that what we are doing today, that what we are collecting means that we guarantee that it's definitely open for you, for your children, for your grandchildren, that there is still an access, that we still work with those collections also in the future like we do since 450 years. And in that variety of money that I raised you the last 15 to 20 years in different positions, it was after reunification. It was honestly easy to raise money for construction. I mean, in a large scale. It was difficult to raise money for staff. It was extremely difficult to raise money for research. And it was nearly impossible to raise money for acquisitions.
Isn't that ironic? You'd think that it would be almost the other way around if the world was standing the right way up. But you know, you're going to go from a country where this idea that art is part of a democratic society was well received. I mean, Germany, you know, is probably if there ever will be a country where that idea will continue to be accepted politically, it will be Germany. Now you're going to go to England, which is in the midst of a very radical rethink of what exactly the government's responsibilities are. Do you think that line will work at 10 Downing Street?
András, I mean, that question is too easy to answer. With a no is really kind of boring in that case. No, but I mean, I'm not sure if one of us sitting here in the panel and you ever expected to have money from the government for a collection. Mm-hmm. And that makes me a little bit frustrated. Right. You know what I mean? Right. I remember I was still in school when we had a kind of one-day internship. And I was in the State Gallery in Stuttgart, where I'm from. And I remember there was a huge meeting. I never forget that day. It was a huge meeting and a quite interesting discussion. And finally, they said, now we talk about the budget. That was the moment when the director got up and said, oh, budget, that's not my topic. So, you know, I mean, those who are older among us still remember that there was money. I mean, so, you know what I mean? We have the censorship already in our brain in saying, no, we don't expect money from the government, so we have to go another direction. So we're used to that. Yeah. And I think the main purpose, talking about the V&A, and it's difficult for me to talk as incoming director, it's difficult to talk about an institution when I start in September. But I mean, we face that challenges, and we have to work with those challenges, and we have to try to guarantee the quality. I think this is what all of us combining us.
Yeah. Well, now to someone who knows very well about operating or the challenges of a museum in a context where the government is definitely not that interested in supporting museums, such as the United States. Nancy, you're observing all this from a unique vantage point, not just because you're the only American on this panel, but because you represent a unique institution, which is, of course, your deputy director and chief curator of the Guggenheim, where, as everybody here knows, she has shaped not only an extraordinary series of seminal exhibitions, about which she's also written a great deal, but also you've been very close to the acquisitions policies of the Guggenheim, which increasingly beg questions of cultural policy in general. And very importantly, you've been around in a period when the Guggenheim forged, seminal collecting partnerships with, in Bilbao and Berlin, most recently in Abu Dhabi. So you're building a transnational collection. That has been the Guggenheim's pathway to both audience development and collection development. So reflect a little bit on that experience.
Thank you, András, and good morning, everyone. Just like to begin by saying that the question of why collect and should one collect, I think that we at the Guggenheim recognize that the collection, which is actually quite small, it's about 7,000 objects, is one of our most important assets. It defines our legacy, that and the Frank Lloyd Wright building. It was a collection founded in the 30s on non-objective art with this great focus on Vasily Kandinsky, so this notion of collecting in depth. And that's something that has been a defining set of parameters for us as we've gone forward. And I've always liked to think that the museum was a museum of contemporary art from the beginning, because the works were being bought from the artist studios. And that's a spirit that we are trying to continue. As András points out, our acquisition budget is less than adequate, to put it mildly. We don't have government support. We don't have a large endowment for buying art. So we've had to be pretty agile and creative. And while Tom Krenz was director for the 20-year period, he really reinvented, I think, for us at least, a way to build the collection that grew out of partnerships with either foreign governments or corporations. I think that the generative moment for that was when the Peggy Guggenheim collection in Venice was bequeathed to the museum in New York in 1976. And that set up the very beginning, the nucleus of what now we call a global network. And that collection actually belongs to the foundation. And we work collectively with the museum in Venice, with loans, etc. But since then, we've now branched out. As you know, we have a museum in Bilbao. And the philosophy behind how we've approached formulating those institutions, building those collections, have been about creating a complementary situation. So in Bilbao, it focuses on European and the American access, so it kind of reflects our relationship from the 50s to the present. And we look to acquire works for Bilbao, with the government of Bilbao, to fill in gaps that we have in New York and to form a narrative that would certainly stand on its own in Bilbao. And we're in the process now in Abu Dhabi, very still early stages of defining what our collection strategy is going to be. But we're using the term transnational because here we are, a Western institution in the Middle East, learning as we go about a culture that has, amazing histories of different modernities, but also an emerging contemporary presence. And in that case, we are, what I see is really an exciting potential for true cross-cultural exchange, because not only are we building a collection there that is transnational, Western, Eastern, Latin American, African, et cetera, and looking for points of correspondence among artists working from 1965 to the present. But it's coming back and informing our collecting practices in New York. And the curators have been able to identify and acquire work by Middle Eastern artists for our collection. And lastly, the partnership we have in Berlin with Deutsche Bank has been enormously fruitful because that's been based on the commission idea. Again, working off of the notion of gaps in the collection. This is fully funded by Deutsche Bank, where we invite artists to create commissions for the space in Berlin, which is much smaller than New York. It's more sort of laboratory-like, and quite wonderful for an artist to focus on, a singular body of work. And that work comes into the Guggenheim collection. It's a co-ownership arrangement over a period of time, but that's been extremely valuable for us. And these were all outgrowths of working with a less than satisfying situation. If we compare ourselves to another museum in New York City, which has a phenomenal collection and phenomenal buying power, it's very depressing, and one cannot keep a pace. But these relationships, I think, are taking us into intellectual realms and cultural realms that we wouldn't have necessarily been able to predict.
Can I ask you, at this point, the commissions and acquisitions through the satellites, relative to commissions acquisitions in New York, are they larger? Would the Bilbao, Abu Dhabi?
The budget is larger, yes.
The budget is larger.
Yes.
Of course, it's an interesting thing because, of course, you're a private institution which has actually collaborated with governments in its growth of its collections. So it's almost going the other way than many European institutions are now thinking. So I want to keep us moving, and we'll get back to some of these issues as we go. But Chris, Dercon, you've been at the Tate Modern now, what, about a year, roughly?
8 weeks.
I'm sorry, 8 weeks. My
That's
goodness.
okay.
It feels
Looks like
it
1
feels
year,
like a
isn't it?
year,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
Right. You can do a lot in 8 weeks.
Yeah.
That's what I mean.
And of course you're Belgian, which means that you're from the country that practically invented private collections.
And doesn't have a national identity.
And doesn't have a
at the same
national
time.
identity to speak of.
But we have surrealism,
Well,
which
there you
means
are.
this is not a museum. So that's
And of course you've had terrific runs in Munich at the Haus der Kunst and at the Boijmans in Rotterdam. Now you have a very small job description, which is to transform one of the world's most popular museums. And 8 weeks in, I think the job is half done, but there's still work to be done. So how do you shape that kind of 21st century role, and where's your thinking about the collection in all of that?
Let me first go back to your introduction. You said we should start talking about what is on the top of our mind. What is on the top of our mind being here in Basel and having to leave after 72 hours because I have to work again, which is, I wonder how many public museums did actually buy works in the past 70 hours here. Probably very few. I also wonder how many major dealers, really good ones, put on reserve for us, public museums, really important works of art. Paradoxically enough, many. That means something because it underwrites what you have been saying, that the collection is the legacy of museums. So we could actually very buy and take our checkbook and say, this is mine, but major dealers said, I want this piece to go to your museum. Just take care, take your time, so that means something. Second, you said that we have to talk first practically and then we're going to talk about the sublime. I don't agree, András. I think we should ask first major questions in order to address the practicalities of the everydays, because I think we live too much in the status quo. So let me, going back to your question now to me in terms of Tate Modern, how do you do that? First of all, a perfect museum does not always necessarily mean a perfect collection. And a perfect collection doesn't always mean a perfect museum. I think the whole notion of ownership, this is mine, is completely changing, and we're going to have to put priorities, if we want it or not on exclusivity, and exclusivity means excludere. We have to go to put the accent on how are we going to use the collection which we have. So usage instead of ownership. And what we try to do at Tate Modern, of course, just like Nancy, we have to be very agile. We have some very basic funding thanks to the big society 10 Downing Street. And you know, when you talk about the big society, for me the big society is not just about the big guys, but the big society is about the really small guys. I mean, that's my answer to Martin. That's what democracy is all about, right? To take care about small guys, minorities. So public museums are minorities, so we have to be taken care of. Now, in terms of this usage, I think it's very simple. Instead of the whole idea of ownership, it's mine, look what I just bought, we have to think about how are we going to use it. And I would like to challenge all of us, public museums, and that's the reason why you private collectors will come to us sooner or later. Don't worry, I'm going to tell you why you will come to us. That is, we have to deal with collections, we have to consider them as an imaginative site and not just as a repository, an imaginative site which boundaries are constantly shifting. I remember Richard Armstrong saying in the New York Times, it's fantastic to be the director of Nancy. It's fantastic to show the same piece over and over again. I think today is the day of context. And the day of context, ladies and gentlemen, I don't find anymore in most private collections. I know some, I visited some in Basel here, and the funny thing is when I think about usage and about the private collection, I first think about memory, not about prices. And you will see that the public doesn't care about how much you paid. The public cares about, are you a first, second, third, fourth generation collector? Where's the memory in your collection? Is your collection a work of art? And that's something I think we can offer in terms of partnerships. So I would like to say ownership is out, it's uncool. The cool thing is what are you going to do about this? So I'm not saying that we don't want to work with private collectors, to the contrary. The question is how. And I think we, at Tate Modern, we are becoming very, very creative in that. There's great enthusiasm. And I think it's because we offer this usage. We offer new ways in how to work constantly shifting the boundaries of the collection and work with the collection.
Give me an example of that.
A very good example is what Tate Modern has been doing since the very beginning, since its opening 10 years ago, in trying to break down the chronology of style in order to tell different stories with the collection. Because it's true, our collection is not the perfect collection, but we have a collection and we have always new things coming in, which allows us to tell the story of a collection and the story of other collections, like reflecting them, mirroring them in many different ways. And I think Tate Modern is, for instance, one of the museums right now worldwide, maybe together with the Guggenheim, but I don't see anybody else, who's really has started to look years ago into other regions. And that makes it so exciting to be able to show a Mondrian, a Van Doesburg, or the style, the Dutch style, and then to show the Brazilians how they, with the neo-concretists, started to interpret the influence of the style, the Dutch style, into these regions in Brazil, for instance, and the influence of Max Bill on Lydia Clark. So these are fantastic stories we can offer to tell, which private collections, who, let's say, started only recently, cannot tell, because there is no Max Bill and there is no Mondrian. And I'm not saying, you know, that's cowardly that you don't have a Mondrian. It is just like that. We can offer a place of memory, which is amazing.
You know, I'll take you up on this idea. Well, let's talk about some of the sublime questions. Why not? I mean, okay, fine. We've got hundreds of museums around the world. And let's maybe focus maybe on the issue of contemporary art for a minute. Amassing enormous collections. We go out in this art fair, we see many of the most important works that would, you know, really quite seminal works produced in editions of 5, 6, 7, ending up in 3, 4, 5 museums identically. There are thousands of artists, obviously. There are new regions that are scaling up production. Now it's Brazil. Next week it's, you know, Eastern Europe, China, India. How can this narrow container of the museum absorb this scale of production, and should it? And how?
Because we have to learn again, and that's what private collectors have also to learn, to develop again criteria. I mean, something we completely lost, and we are facing since years, also in the art fair in Basel, a total erosion of the whole idea of criticality. We are living in a paradox that so many pieces are dealing with criticality, but we ourselves don't have any criteria anymore. When I took our patrons around, I said, we are going to talk this afternoon about why is a work of art, why can a work of art be bad? And how are we going to talk about bad art? Some people looked at me and said, no, we don't want to talk about that which is bad. We only want to talk about good things. We want to be enthusiastic because we love art. I think loving art is developing criteria to talk about that which is bad, which is not good, like overblown works of art, which are now on view at Art Unlimited. Why are these not good? I think developing criteria is really something really important to begin with, and we in museums can do that.
Well, I'd like to ask your esteemed colleagues on that. I mean, how do you grapple with these issues in your respective posts? Particularly, I think Nancy would be.
For the Guggenheim, it certainly criteria comes into play, but it's also what narrative are we going to be constructing? And we're at a point right now looking forward because of the activity in Abu Dhabi and other partnerships that are in formation. You know, given that we still have limited space, limited resources, what is the story that we want to tell? And I can't say today what that is, but some of the things that we're really thinking about, based on our own history, because I think one has to be true to the legacy, the founding vision of an institution, unless you're going to radically change something. And I think all of the curators and Richard Armstrong do not feel that that's really our mission to do, but how do you enrich, et cetera. So we were the museum of the other modernity. It's not the French school. It's not Cézanne into Picasso, it's Kandinsky and the Blauer Reiter. So what does that mean? And some of the things that we're beginning to look at from an exhibition point of view, and we try to link our exhibition programming with our acquisitions programming, is we're doing a Gutai exhibition, we're doing a Zero exhibition. And I would see our collection moving in those directions. That doesn't speak to the work made yesterday, but those are guiding principles for us. We've also always, because of the Panza collection that came into the museum in the 1990s, we have collected with that in mind. So there's a strong conceptual strain as we look at contemporary art.
Right. Well, I mean, but creating a narrative and filling gaps is one question. What Chris is saying, because he likes to throw bombs, is we actually have to set criteria. How do you set criteria when we've spent the last 40 years demolishing criteria?
Yeah, but I mean, this is the easiest part of it. Always first quality. No, I mean,
but what is quality, Martin?
It might be easier than old master.
Then it's got really basic. Let me just give 3 different ideas.
Okay.
But I mean, it's a long detour now. The first part of it, I mean, I wouldn't sit here today if Dresden would have been collected for 450 years first quality. I remember you saying, when we started more or less at the same time, you in Munich and I in Dresden, if they know what they have and they start marketing with those collections, that's going to be unbelievable. And he's right. He was right. I mean, what, sitting there is unbelievable in that small city. I mean, the museum is far too big for their own city. So, but one of the recipes for this success was always first quality. I came from the Vatican yesterday.
Speaking of quality.
Speaking of quality, we signed a contract for a Raphael leaving the first time the Vatican, coming to Dresden while the Pope is in Germany. This is an amazing event. If we come back to the story of the Raphael, how the Raphael came 500 years ago, 16 Madonna, to Dresden. This is exactly like the discussion today. Blackmailing, too much money involved, a lot of art agents going around, and so on. I mean, the way to collect has always this kind of discussions, business around, and so on. I mean, that was the second comment. The third one, I mean, honestly, let's all be really lucky how those times are, Chris. I mean, that we discuss about the political issues like China, our discussion, we don't talk about that. But that the whole world is watching what's going on in the art world concerning those problems. I mean, that creates a kind of awareness, and that's amazing. That wasn't there 20, 30 years ago.
Right.
So this kind of political context around the art, I think, is extremely helpful and much better than other parts of politics. And the third one, why don't we always think that the same eye level, the same museum has to work with the same museums? I mean, there are possibilities like the Potlatch exhibition that we do right now in Dresden, that you work with small communities, that you work with small museums, that you invite other communities to be part of of those museums cooperations. And the last topic, I mean, Dresden has this, I mean, it's a heritage of GDR. It's the so-called Kunstfonds, just a little bit money, small budget.
I know, but
collecting those young artists, and that's the reason why we have Neo Rauch and Afrikos and a lot of other quite famous painters now in our collection that started years ago.
So I really would love to believe, Martin, but I don't think that the word quality is the magic word anymore. I mean, just a quote from a good friend who was an amazing theoretician, Benjamin Bucklow. He said that one of the biggest challenges today for both the left, the right, progressive, conservative, public museums, private collectors, name it, is this challenge which was offered to us at the beginning of the 20th century about quality as dequalification, in the sense of de-skilling in the Duchampanian way. I mean, in an area, and Nancy's very good at that because you worked with a lot of so-called de-skilling artists. Think of Mauricio Catalan, think of Ricri Teravanidja, you know, who say good work is less work. I mean, try to restrain. I mean, in this complex world of all these different, sometimes even delayed modernities, in this very complex world of contemporaneity, where the word de-skilling is one of the magic words instead of quality, I mean, we really have to develop new criteria. My criteria is, instead of accumulating stuff and then see what will come next, and of course then, if we don't do that, we are going to miss some artists, and I missed in my life. Doing shows and doing other things, I missed artists, really, because I didn't take the risk. But in order to collect right now, developing criteria, for me, one of the most important criteria is every piece we acquire, or we are being given, or being promised, has to be so painful as to create a turning point, looking again at major part of the collections again. Like a revolving door. A very important acquisition is like a revolving door. It's like an exit and an entrance at the same time for the whole collection, for the museum. And that's how I now look at Tate Modern, at which piece we should collect. And God thank, we have fantastic staffers, we have specialists, and these specialists means that they are able to develop criteria. Now, at the other hand, besides the specialists, that's the last thing I'm going to say about it, we have the non-specialists. And the non-specialists are as important as our curators and as our friends, really friends, not aliens, but people of alliances, which are the private collectors, which are all these people, like, you know, the Conrads in this room. Conrad, where are you? Who are making, these are kids who are going to grow up and they're going to be artists in themselves without naming themselves artists. There is a whole bunch of new generations, think of New Tube, who are making these art pieces for themselves. And they don't need private collectors anymore, and they don't need museums anymore. They definitely don't need private museums. Ooh, that's really uncool, okay?
Well, I think that the theme of the panel should be just say no, or how to say no. It's almost like what seems to, you know, be on top of your mind is how do you have criteria for making sure that what you do allow into the sanctum, if you will, of a museum doesn't just rubber stamp the consensus that is formed, well, right here in Art Basel. But, you know, let me frame the question in a slightly different way. There's a different tension, because we're not going to resolve the meaning of quality. This is not a hermeneutics or, you know, seminar or whatever. But I think that what we can do is maybe think about the challenge of certain types of balancing acts that you all have to deal with. And one of them is this question, you know, many of you have already alluded to this role of the museum as a change agent in society. You know, museums, we now expect our museums to be at the forefront of social change, to engage communities, to address social problems, to offer an interface with forms of culture which lie in amateur arts or even outside the visual arts. So on the one hand, we have this idea of the museum as this innovating, cutting-edge institution. On the other hand, the museum is collecting is a fundamentally, in the best sense of the word, conservative function. You're conserving for the future.
Sure.
So how do you free up the museum to be this radical, change-oriented thing which many stakeholders, public officials, and societies want, while at the same time your DNA is all about caring for these collections.
No, András, I'm really happy that, that you start that question, that you raised that question again, because I wonder, Nancy and Chris, how you managed to work with all those partners and partnerships and with private collectors and companies and so on to create this kind of quality and to continue with your own concept and your own idea. Because I think in our case, and still talking about Dresden, not about London, it was extremely difficult, but it helped pretty much that there were not too many choices. I admire what Thomas Gierst is doing for BMW, but I don't want BMW creating the state legacy and cultural heritage of Saxony or whatever. You know what I mean? They are this kind of partnership. They are extremely important for an intellectual debate and for special projects and research program. By creating a legacy, conservation for the future, that's something different.
We're working with BMW, you know.
Sure, I know. Actually, that's the reason why same here.
Yeah, no.
So do they dictate what you have to do?
No. That's the bottom line for us for any partnership.
Don't get me wrong. I like what they are doing, but we talk about conservation for the future.
No, we only enter into agreements that the Guggenheim has content control. So that's a given. And I can say, particularly with BMW, that's been the case. Of course, there's friction, not necessarily this is a new relationship, but over the years with various partners, there's, of course, competing agendas and stuff, but curatorial content is the purview of the Guggenheim.
Look, in a world where, let's say, the profit sector is looking very carefully about how and what we are doing in the non-profit sector, and in a world where the non-profit sector is not forced, but is really like wanting to work in a new way with the private or profit sector, the question is not, and that's the reason why we cannot avoid sublime questions, the question is not, do we want to work with them, but how are we going to work with them? And to answer the whole idea of the private collections, okay, the private museums, we see this blossoming, this blooming like mushrooms everywhere of private museums in the whole world. They use the same architects, the same white walls, the same architecture, and the same works of art, most of them. There are exceptions. For me, the exceptions are those private collections which are working, functioning like works of art. And in Basel, you have many of them. What is a work of art in terms of a collection? It's a place of memory and not a place of, let's say, a kind of industrial production where the whole idea of the sublime is based in sheer aesthetical pleasure in terms of spectacle, not residing in memory. Now, when we take all these private collectors who have these private amazing museums right now, even when they look the same and behave the same, we know that we have to come to an arrangement. We know that sooner or later, and we have, and that's one of the sublime questions, we have to do now to do an exercise in very long-term thinking. Because it cannot go on, and the private collectors, they know, even when they accumulate within 5 years, not a museum, not a collection, but just works of art, they know that they will have to come to us to work together. Because some of the private collectors who did this a couple of years ago, they asked me questions like, Chris, why is the press still not liking me, the art newspaper? Why is the public still taking me not seriously? Why are they jealous? I'm good.
It's the corporate collections.
And the corporate collections too. Then they say to me, my God, how are you able to pay all of this? It's so expensive. I cannot keep going on with this. Then they say, the artists are still not pleased. I have 150 Gunther Fawkes, and he's still not pleased that I show 20 each time. Yeah. So, there are all these incredible tensions right now, and I think they are productive tensions, and in one way or another, we will find ourselves again back on track.
Could you?
Well, just to
what
say
do you think,
that,
Nancy?
well, the Guggenheim Museum was a private collection. Solomon R. Guggenheim, Peggy Guggenheim was a private collection. The Panza collection, we have over 300 works, was a private collection. We actually think of ourselves as a compilation of private collections in many ways. So I think what Chris is saying, there is a certain amount of patience, but also a creative exchange that has to happen, a dialogue. Because there are private collectors doing amazing things and things that we don't have the resources to do. But as long as we stay in dialogue, we actually are purchasing with a private collector, sharing works, because sometimes, at least when he was starting out, it was very difficult for him to be able to acquire works that was reserved for museums, though I have to say I haven't seen as many dealers squirreling away the best works for the Guggenheim.
For Tate they do. I don't know what it says about
okay,
us.
I'm going to have to look into this. But this is yet another type of relationship that we're formulating with an investment in future.
And good collectors, they want this dialogue. And it's almost like a natural shift. I'm not a Darwinist, but it's really true that, you know, the great collectors who aspire certain things, who have ambitions, they come to talk to us, to our curators, they come to talk to our development people, and it's really great. The dialogue is already there. So there is a natural shift, so I'm not obliged to say you're not good enough as a collector, I don't need to talk to you.
Well, look, it's, you know, I always like to say collecting is a form of deferred philanthropy. You know, eventually this material, the best of it, will end up in museums, so
Right.
we hope. But you know, what do you say to those who believe that museums have become, especially publicly financed museums, have risked far too much of the public's money on risky contemporary art, and that perhaps the right division of labor should be let the private collectors and the private museums do the very risky first phase, if you will, investing in the latest art of today. Let them take on that risk, and then when things have settled down, let the best of that work end up in the public collections.
András,
Is
I'm
that the model?
so disappointed about what you are saying right now. Really, you can't. I mean, you cannot even afford to bring this up. This is populist.
No, I'm saying,
This
what
is
do
a
you
very
say to
populist
those?
stand. I'm saying to those,
Because
very
that's how the
simple,
press is
that
presenting it.
we really know how to tell the story of contemporary art, and even the most difficult contemporary art. Tate Modern and German museums, and also the Guggenheim, we are really like, I mean, I hate to say this, we are really like cool.
You're cool.
People,
I think
people,
we've established that they're cool.
people, young people, different audiences, they like to come to us and they like to hear these stories. And what you're telling is true for the 80s and maybe part of the 90s, but it's over. I mean, contemporary art, even the most difficult stuff, is like the thing to do. And we
No,
have
but
to
that's a risky position.
we have to creatively abuse this position. We have to. And in order to talk to Dan Downing Street, for instance, I remember meeting Ed Cameron at a dinner, and he said to me, how many people do you really have annually visiting? I said, it's really true, Ed. We have 4.7 million.
Right.
Of which, he said, how many young kids who do not really immediately understand contemporary art. I said, we really live in our big society because 35% of our visitors are younger than 35. They really like to see things. They like to learn. Learning is a kind of performativity. It's performing. I mean, we are becoming a place, a museum, which the collection is part of. It's even the legacy, absolutely, admittedly. But we are becoming a place like a secular cathedral where people like to treasure out all sorts of questions, big and small, at hand of works of art. I mean, they ask us questions about families, about sustainability, about ecology, about multiculturalism, about sexual identity. They ask us these questions because these questions, they feel, are not asked anymore in other environments. Now the question is, how are we going to work with our public, with our new audiences, not having them to come in, but how are we going to engage with them a dialogue of one-to-one? We already started in the Guggenheim, in Tate. I'm very happy to say that now Nancy's sitting here. We are the best in the world after the MoMA, okay, in Facebook and Twitter. I mean, so we are
Justin Bieber.
we are equals, number 2 in the world. But you know, we have established this one-to-one communication, answering these questions also about the collection, which is great.
Fantastic. I want to say everyone on this panel is cool, with the possible exception of me. But just quickly, how many people might have questions? Okay, that's good. That makes okay. Good. We'll do those in a minute. We started a bit late, but I want to now, for just 5 minutes, get to those practical issues that I think we can now take up, having done the sublime thing a little bit. And I just want to do it in a very, very basic way. 2 big questions which clearly have to be looked at, are hanging over this issue. One is financing, monetizing. Where do you get money? And the other is collaboration. How can you do more collaborating between collections, knowing that everybody's sitting on these vast piles of art? how can we do a more efficient job of making something out of that? So I just want to ask each of you, very specifically, in your respective domains, where do you see possibilities for better monetizing in some way the collections, finding financing for it, whether it's your position on deaccessioning, whether it's other possibilities for recognizing that you have tremendous assets and at the same time you're squeezed for cash? That's one question, and I would like to hear practical examples. And the other one is, what do you see as truly great examples of collaborative acquisition or stewardship of art that would eliminate some of the inefficiencies? Specific practical examples.
Do you want me to start? I mean, first coming back to your former, the question you raised before, András, I mean, this is, because it's related to it. I mean, what you said before is really, you wanted to provoke. That's
it's a red hat.
Sure, clear. But I mean, that's definitely a risky question. I remember that one of the Minister of Finance in Germany said years ago, the cultural business or the cultural field is something, cultural landscape is something like, we provide the Autobahn and the private collectors are the cars on that freeway. And this is horrible. I mean, this has nothing to do with taste, that has nothing to do with style, nothing with education, nothing with heritage. So you are the one who has to make the choice, again, about quality and what you want to give to the future, and not somebody else for you. So that's I think it's exactly the opposite.
But you hear it all the time. You hear this.
Sure, but that's the reason why we have to do something against it. I mean, we never talk about money. So that's the reason why it's a bit difficult to answer your question, but I think it has always been the same. It's just shifting between priorities, and my priorities are definitely different one from my colleagues in New York and London right now. Because, I mean, what we had to do was to reconstruct, to stabilize, to make it safety, to bring that collection still suffering from the after-war times and the times when everything came back from the Soviet Union. So to make things clear, stable, and so on and so on. So that's one part of it. But the other part is that we try to raise money from all different directions. I mean, fortunately, there are the state foundations in Germany that helps really a lot. Then there are the private foundation and the private sector. And if there's a chance to convince the government to support you in acquisitions, then we do it. But it's always a variety of everything. What I was really kind of, I mean, not asking for, I was really kind of begging on my knees, was to get a kind of what we call Feuerwehrfonds, fire brigade fund, because quite often there's something on the market, sometimes connected with the restitutions and whatever. So we need a budget immediately, in like 24 hours.
Opportunity fund, yeah.
I mean, 24 hours, like now or never, because otherwise it's gone. And this is not existing. That makes it extremely difficult.
And if you can't go to a bank?
No, not as a state collection.
Not
I mean,
as a state collection.
I think you can do it, we can't. So, no, I'm going to be, you see me next time in a different way. So, that's risky. And, I mean, there's not this kind of short-term decision-making. And again, what's really difficult is this kind of creating a kind of long-term perspective in terms of acquisition. What I'm totally against, and I think you both have, or hopefully you have a different position, is this kind of selling out of the collection. I mean, first of all, I mean, we have beautiful examples like in Dresden, while directors with a different taste made horrible decisions. And the opposite, by the way. We bought a beautiful Mantegna in London, late 19th century, beautiful. It was not in fashion at that time. The Holy Family, beautiful painting today, but it was not like Chris would say, cool at that time. So that's one difficulty, and the other one, I mean, we don't have to talk about that today, but with this history of the Third Reich and the GDR, where the politicians just walked into the storage rooms and took out the paintings and objects and sold it. This is definitely not a topic for Germany today.
Again, just quickly, any specific great examples of or opportunities you see in collaboration, or that you've either done or you feel that are out there as possibilities, and also in injecting resources?
I mean, in terms of Tate Modern, one of the great initiatives which was developed a couple of years ago with the Scottish National Gallery is, of course, Artist Rooms, which was an initiative by the directors of Tate and the director of the Scottish National Gallery and the former dealer collector Anthony Duffy, which is an amazing way of collaborating with a private collector who was once a dealer, who has still these incredible connections with the art world, with private collectors, but also with artists. And one of the things I think which is truly successful is it's not based on this is mine, it's based on, you know, to give something back. And you know that Artist Rooms is not just Tate Modern, it's not just the Scottish National Gallery. It's an initiative which is developed because it's touring through the regional museums, through the region. And we know also partially because of the big society, that these regional museums in Great Britain are suffering and going to suffer even more. So that's, I think, a truly great example of partnership. The new thing on the block is partnership, discovering new ways of collaboration. Artist Rooms with Anthony Duffy is one great example. Another example, of course, is our forthcoming collaboration with Art Angel. Art Angel, the production house in Great Britain, who produced these impossible pieces, like there were pieces which a museum never could commission, which a museum never could produce, not even a private collector. And we are developing with them in a relationship that, just like Artist Rooms, we are going to keep the body of Art Angel within the holdings of Tate. We're going to make sure that they get to be seen, not just in the regional museums, but maybe also in Europe. So these are new forms of collaboration. There are many, many more. Our acquisitions committees, where we work with people from the regions who tell us what could be interesting, who are kind of judges, who are kind of formulating new criteria by asking questions. That is, that is a great thing to do. So these are three examples, I would say, of a partnership. So the word partnership is crucial. It's dialogue. The same goes for corporations, the same goes for sponsors. No option is to have private collectors, to have private corporations to tell us what to do. It's no option for the good private collectors, and it's no option for the good sponsors either. I mean, we are working on dialogue with many different corporations, and we see that what they want to hear from us is, what are your criteria? How are you dealing with younger generations? How are you dealing with the tastes of younger generations? How do you make subjective decisions? And these questions partially are also private collectors interested in. So it's partnership, establishing criteria, it's formulating good questions. I believe in sociology. You know that sociology is the science of asking perfect questions. And only by asking perfect questions you might have good answers. So I think we have to train ourselves in that.
Well, as a sociologist, let me ask you, Nancy, just specifically anything you want to say about maybe something we haven't heard in terms of partnerships or joint acquisitions, or something that the Guggenheim is working with beyond Abu Dhabi that would be interesting, and then we'll go to a couple of questions.
I think it's more, I know this is a collection panel, but as I spoke earlier about some of the very fruitful relationships that we've had, such as the Deutsche Bank commission series, which, you know, the Sugimoto portraits, for instance, the wax that grew out of a commission from the Guggenheim. But what we're also finding in terms of partnerships is a new kind of sponsorship. And you mentioned BMW, but there are sponsors who are interested in helping us support knowledge production. And that may, in the end, begin to bolster our collection, because we're not quite sure what will come out of this. We're doing these BMW Guggenheim labs in different cities around the world that investigate issues that pertain to the environment, urban living, architecture, design, et cetera. But these are new relationships that we're formulating, and there are a few more in the works, and they're designed on, you know, obviously strengthening the health of the institution, but knowledge production, which in my mind goes along with commissions. So we're directly supporting the artists, directly supporting the thinkers, the designers, the architects, in a relationship that I think will bode well for our future.
And it also goes back to this expanding of the idea of collecting with the contextualization of the collection.
You know, András, a good museum wants to become a site of exception.
Right.
And this site of exception, the collection is the backbone, but it does not mean that the site of exception equals the collection. We have many more things to do. And I think that's where we starting to find new grounds in order to talk about collectors, corporations, because indeed, things are far beyond exclusivity and they are far beyond ownership. Yeah. This whole idea of, look at me, this is mine, over.
I mean, it's pretty much the same, but there's something I regret since years, and I don't know why we never changed it. I mean, we have all at least European collections in those huge museums complexes in Europe. For example, for Dresden, it would be much better to work together. Let's say with the Prado in Madrid, just an example, in terms of research, in terms of restoration, conservation, but also acquisitions. But we still are in the same boundaries. We're still in these different national systems in Europe, and that's really a problem. Once we are over this topic, I think it's definitely easier to share collections, to share ideas, and much more.
Obviously, there's a million things we didn't talk about, but I just want to get a couple of questions. Could you raise your hands if you have a question? And I think there's a microphone coming your way, and if you are willing to tell us who you are, please do. Yes, there's a microphone right to your left, sir. So tell us who you are if you can, and then ask a question.
I'm Jonathan Bragdon. My hidden agenda, I'll say right away, is I make small drawings. So in this this idea of the shift from private, from ownership to possession to usage, and I see this context of the museum as serving a kind of a huge population and using new media. What is the fate of intimacy in this new situation? How can the museum in this new situation, can it be a place for intimacy?
Anyone?
Oh, I think anything that we're saying does not preclude tradition. We're just adding layers. And it's interesting to bring up because we're discovering, as an institution that hasn't historically collected works on paper, that the tradition in the Middle East is just that. So we're thinking it in terms of a contemporary acquisition strategy as how we, both for our museum in New York and the Frank Gehry building in Abu Dhabi, which is quite large, exactly those questions is how do you preserve the intimacy of that work?
Other question? Right here in the front.
Hello, I'm Miriam Weston from the Museum of Modern Art in Arnhem. I have a question to Nancy Spector. Do you experience censorship from working with your corporations in the Middle East? And my second question is to all three of you. Did you buy anything on the Art Basel? I mean, I'm not asking what did you buy, but did you buy? Thank you.
Answer your second question from the Guggenheim's point of view, no, we did not buy. Censorship. No, we have not. Our museum is not built yet. Our program is not put in place, but it's an ongoing discussion with our stakeholders there about the issues of free expression, and it's something that we're very committed to.
Gentlemen, did you buy anything?
No, but I pointed out certain booths and pieces to our friends, private collectors, who are actively supporting us through different acquisition committees. And they got so enthusiastic that, they went up to the dealers and say, Tate Modern would like to have that piece, I would like to help them. So, I mean, I didn't buy because I don't want to buy. I'm just like an overarching kind of helicopter pilot, GPS system. Call me the GPS system. So I didn't buy. Second thing is I did buy something, and I bought at a fantastic exhibition in Basel. I bought a little book by Sternberg Press about free labor and the whole transformation from the homo ludens, the playing man, into the homo precarius, the precarious man. And that's something I'm really concerned by this whole idea of free labor and by exploitation of free time, leisurist time. So I bought that book, and it cost €13.50, and you should all buy it.
Martin?
No, no chance.
Not even a book, Martin, about IRA. See, now I get it.
Once I'm in London, I learned it from you.
Did you get the book? That's a good one. Okay.
I'll take one more question from. Yes, right in the front.
Thank you so much for the very interesting conversation. The
Who
question
are you? Who are you?
My name is Iban. I'm a curator from Bangladesh.
Oh, great.
The question I have, actually, I think it's two-pronged. We are throwing around some massively politically loaded tropes. You know, we're talking about memory, we're talking about standard, we are talking about taste. I mean, the paradigm has shifted. There's new scholarship that's been, you know, that's been grown in some part of the world. And I mean, my question is, are we ready to embrace the Euro-eccentric vantage points when we're collecting for the museums, European museums? That's number one. Number two, it's, you know, especially this is to Chris actually. I have worked a little more than 8 weeks in London. And I...
Good for you.
Thank you.
You should meet up sometime.
Right. Do you have a place to live already?
Give me a rest.
And I have actually, when Tate Modern was developing the Cultural Olympic, you know, in 2012 and all that, you know, I was involved a little bit. And there was this, you know, huge Bangladeshi, Pakistani, Indian community in London. And they, I mean, I don't know if you have the statistics. I mean, I don't think there's like more than 8% of this demography, they are engaged with Tate. And why should they? Because you are telling a story. I mean, you talk about memory. And when you're acquiring contemporary art, it's not only memory of the past, it's memory of the future. And as a political institution, Tate is organizing public memory. Right. And these people are not included in this memory. Mm-hmm. So my question is, are you ready to, you know, this dark, uncouth people come in and challenge the grand narrative you're creating with your arts? You know, can we just get there and erupt with our micro-narratives?
I think that's a fantastic question, and it's a very important one, and it's also easy to answer, and I tell you why. You remember that Tate Modern opened 10 years ago with the exhibition Century Cities, where we focused on cities like Moscow, but also cities like Bombay. That was the very opening, and it was an exhibition where we really focused, when really digging into the histories of the different modernities of these cities by focusing on some artists. Some of them were even photographers, industrial designers. I remember that Okwi and Wazor focused in Century City on Lagos in the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. So talking about micro-narratives, I mean, Tate Modern started right there. Other thing is that, yes, we are working on different communities, on different publics. We have to, because we are based in the south of London. And the south of London is absolutely...
Sorry, I'm going to interrupt you, but
right.
The thing is,
right.
Working with them is one thing, but embracing the new values that will enable them to stage the new narrative. You know, do you have any procedure, any protocol to embrace the new values?
We have a protocol because we are actively acquiring works from the region, including Bangladesh, and we are very consciously making plans, not for the next 5 years, but for the next 12 months, to integrate these acquisitions, which we did in the past years, to integrate them in our displays where we talk about Tate Modern, about modernities. Remember that we did the exhibition of Amrita Shergill 3 years ago, an exhibition which came from Munich to Tate Modern. Amrita Shergill is not an artist you can find at Hauser and Wirth. It's not an artist you can find at White Cube. It's an artist who disappeared in 1937. I mean, we are building in these micro-narratives very consciously, and I think together with the Guggenheim, I'm not saying this because Nancy's sitting here, that we are one of the rare museums truly concentrating on these micro-narratives, but working with our local publics is as important, not in order to have them come in, but in order to, you know, defy them in terms of to engage with works of arts. And that's the reason why I'm very happy that we are based in the south of London.
Nancy?
I just wanted to also respond. I think that's such a critical question and something we're thinking about deeply because of Abu Dhabi. And we just had last month in Abu Dhabi our first focus group discussions in which we invited scholars and curators and critics from around the region, from India, actually no one from Bangladesh this time, to really listen and learn. Because we went in there talking about, for instance, pre and post-war. And the question was, what war? And that was a wake-up call on many levels. And as I mentioned before, this is all resonating back to our program in New York. It will take some time, but it's an awareness that we're gaining that's absolutely critical to the future of the institution.
We are pretty much out of time. I just want to say we covered a lot of ground. There was some ground that we couldn't cover. We didn't talk enough about the complexities of getting into other parts of the world and the various pools of hot water you can find yourself in. We didn't talk that much about technology. But I think we did cover an awful lot of ground, and I think we can say that we did two things. One is we made a very uncool topic very cool, very quickly. And the other thing is that we did something that is actually exceedingly rare, which is we had major institutions talking about these challenges which they're confronting together and yet rarely addressing together. So just quickly in closing, one word from each of you. Out of everything we talked about today, what was the single most important thing for this audience to take home? Chris?
That is, we are going to work together, but it's not about what do you own and what do we own. It's like how we're going to use these things.
Martin?
I like very much the last question that came from you. I think the museums, the cultural landscape is much more advanced than our societies. So we have to come back with that, what we did during the last years with all this global debate and international thinking, much more in our homeland, back home and translate it there again. And that's the way we have to use the collection. So I don't know, I have no tools and I don't know how to do it, but the question you raised is extremely important in my case.
Nancy, last word is yours.
It's actually something that Chris articulated, which is something that I believe we've been doing intuitively at the Guggenheim, which is the necessity of being socially relevant, the secular cathedral, being a place where debate can happen about issues that are not spoken about often in school or religious communities. And I like to think that our programming and our collection choices revolve around that, but hearing that today
That's definitely
gave
something
me,
we share.
more resolution.
Well, thank you to our panelists. Thank you to all of you. Enjoy the fair.